Hey everybody, this is section 1 of chapter 3 of part 1 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the New Marx reading in the Federal Republic since 1965. Part 1 of the book is titled Reflections on the Theoretical Foundations of Value. Chapter 3 itself is titled Object Theoretical Consequences. Just the chapter as a whole, I'll read out the table of contents for this entire chapter, which extends beyond this single recording. So this first section is titled, which is the what this video is titled Critique of Pre-Monetary Value Theory, Abstract Labor, Value, and Money, with the subheadings 1. Marx versus Engels and Marx versus Marx. 2. Critiques of the mode of conceptual development of monetary value. 3. Engaging with or sidestepping ambivalences. Intraparadigmatic variance in the debate concerning Marx's non/substantialist value theory. Section 2 is titled Value, Form Analysis, and Money, on the debate regarding popularizations, discontinuities, and concealments in Marx's exposition, with the headings 1. The redundancy thesis of logico-historical orthodoxy. 2. Clarifying the relationship between the first two chapters, popularization, discontinuity, historicization, ? 3. New confusions, ? And then section 3 of chapter 3 is titled Excursus on Value Theory as Capital Theory. So here we go. As is already more than merely hinted at in the previous chapter, the methodological differences both between historicism and the quote logical interpretation of dialectical exposition, and between the analytical and quote Hegelian Marxist variants of the new reading, are inextricably linked to assumptions regarding the theory of the object. These assumptions do not concern matters of mere detail, rather they constitute the paradigmatic core of the respective positions. It is through them that one can discern precisely what is to be regarded, in the first place, as the object of Marx's critique of political economy. To begin with, one of the key discoveries of the new reading of Marx, namely its recognition of Marx's theory as a monetary theory of value, will be presented. The constructions of the form genetic method, which in chapter 1.2, so that's chapter 2 of the first part, may have appeared somewhat abstract, will now be successively discussed and refined in the following sections by reference to specific substantive themes: the concept of abstract labor in section 1, the analysis of value forms and the process of exchange in section 2, and the transition from money to capital in section 3. The first section of this chapter reconstructs the pivotal stages that were instrumental in the trajectory of the reconstruction of Marx, ranging from the identification of a contradiction between the value theories of Marx and Engels to the diagnosis of ambivalences within the value theory of Marx's critique of political economy itself. The second section, too, in the form of an excursus, examines critiques regarding the mode of conceptual presentation of a monetary theory of value. The third section, section 3, meanwhile, outlines alternative approaches to addressing the Marxian ambivalences, or what are perceived as such within the discourse of the quote New Marx reading. So here we are. This is the section that this chapter is covering, which is section 1 of chapter 3, which is titled Critique of Pre-Monetary Value Theory, Abstract Labor, Value, and Money. Heading 1 is Marx versus Engels and Marx versus Marx. It is Hans-Georg Backhaus's materials for the reconstruction of Marx's theory of value that first devote themselves in detail to the object theoretical implications of a consistent formal analysis. In the first part of his materials from 1974, Backhaus criticizes for the first time Engels' historicist interpretation of the first three chapters of Marx's Capital as a theory of, quote, simple commodity production, which until the publication of Helmut Reichhelt's work shaped the reception patterns of Marx's theory of value. He states, quote, that from this fundamental error, Marx's theory of value had to block the understanding of Marx's, end quote. In this context, the Marxist tradition does not address the, quote, internal intertwining of Marx's analysis of value and money, and thus remains, quote, on the ground of pre-Marxist theory, end quote. According to Backhaus, the fundamental problems of Marxist and bourgeois political economy have, quote, one and the same cause. Economism in the sense of on critique. Backhaus thus accuses the Marxist debate on the categories of capital of nothing less than fundamentally contradicting its core tenets. In Part 2 of the 1975 materials, the thesis regarding a shared theoretical foundation for Marxist and, quote, bourgeois value theory is further elaborated. According to this view, both approaches, in introducing their fundamental concepts, refer back to a, quote, real or fictitious natural exchange economy, end quote, and are therefore to be characterized as, quote, pre-monetary value theories, end quote. Their fundamental concepts are held to be, quote, neither amenable to nor in need of further determination in terms of monetary theory, end quote. A characteristic that is methodologically reflected in a non-dialectical strategy of conceptual development. Consequently, Backhaus argues that both Marxist and bourgeois political economy exhibit two methodological concepts, discussed here in the final chapter, of, quote, of historicism and methodology. One second. See what this translate says. Because that is the word that's used in the original. Okay, it's just mythology. It just translated the thing, like, I guess, directly as spelling, so as spelled. So, consequently, Backhaus argues that both Marxist and bourgeois political economy exhibit two methodological concepts discussed here in the final chapter of historicism and mythology. These entail, respectively, an empiricist reifying and a model theoretic fictionalist form of pre-monetary value theory. The former aligns itself with Engels' theorem of, quote, simple commodity production, specifically by treating Marx's theoretical propositions on value as, quote, fully valid for pre-capitalist commodity production. The proponents cited by Backhaus, such as Ernest Mandel or E.W. Ilyenkov, proceed, much like Adam Smith, from the premise of the historical reality of commodity exchange based on the conscious measurement of quantities of labor time. They regard the determinations of the, quote, origin of capital as a description of a, quote, economic reality that can exist prior to, outside of, and independently of all the phenomena that subsequently emerged on its basis. This reality is the direct exchange of one commodity for another, end quote. Accordingly, conceptual development is understood as the reconstruction of a real historical trajectory, transitioning from one external measure of value to another. The second interpretation conceptualizes the early stages of scientific exposition as fictional models intended to serve as a didactic introduction to the complexity of modern social organization and to elucidate the quote, effects of capital upon the laws of such a society, one in which workers are still able to repurchase their own products, whereby the categories of quote, essence and quote, appearance play no role. According to Backhaus, both readings fail to recognize that Marx proceeds with the specific aim of, quote, conceptually developing money, end quote, while simultaneously subjecting to critique pre-monetary theories of value, such as those espoused by Smith, Ricardo, or Proudhon. Value, Backhaus argues, is understood by classical economists, as well as by their utopian socialist heirs, as merely a regulator of exchange relations between commodities, rather than as an essence that necessarily manifests itself in money. Backhaus clearly points out the constitutive connection between Engels' historical understanding of dialectics and his pre-monetary theory of value, a theory operating with Smithian fictions of a direct labor quantity determined exchange of commodities between deer and beaver hunters. If the conceptual deficiencies of undeveloped value forms are taken to represent real difficulties inherent in a moneyless commodity exchange, then an empirical referent is assigned to these categories. Money is conceived as a conventionally introduced technical instrument for facilitating exchange, one that is external to the form of value. And Marx's development of the money form is reinterpreted as an empirical hypothesis regarding historical processes that require historiographical illustration. To illustrate the validity of Backhaus's thesis regarding the complete identity between the monetary theory derived from Engels' commentaries and classical political economic monetary theory, is worth briefly examining the argumentative strategy employed by Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations. According to Smith, the quote, true measure of the exchange value of commodities in a quote, early and rude state of society, end quote, is labor that is compared according to the criteria of time, effort, and skill. This labor, quote, was the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things, end quote. Exchange based on simple labor time, or respectively labor effort, is a process of non-monetary commodity exchange that is empirically ascertainable and observable, albeit not entirely straightforward. The parties to the exchange are aware of how arduous and time-consuming is the labor required to produce each of the commodities being exchanged. It is the empirical, pragmatic problems inherent in pre-monetary exchange that lead to the adoption of various commodities and ultimately of a single specific commodity as a standard of value. 1. The reciprocal satisfaction of needs is difficult to achieve in a system of exchange that lacks a universal medium of exchange. If the butcher desires the baker's product, but the baker does not desire the butcher's, quote, no exchange can take place between them, end quote. Consequently, quote, every prudent man, end quote, will accumulate a stock of generally accepted media of exchange. 2. Exchange by means of the true measure of value. Labor is initially supplanted by exchange utilizing a variety of measures of value. This is because, firstly, it is, quote, often difficult to determine precisely the ratio between the two different quantities of labor, end quote. Second, because commodities are exchanged against other commodities more frequently than directly against labor, making it therefore, quote, more natural to measure exchange value by the quantity of other commodities, and thirdly, because most people understand better what is meant by a specific quantity of another commodity than what is meant by a specific quantity of labor. 3. Compared to measuring value in terms of a range of different products, measuring it in terms of a single product, money, is, quote, more natural and more readily at hand, end quote. The butcher, therefore, prefers to say that, quote, a pound of his meat is worth 3 or 4 pence, end quote, rather than saying that, quote, it is worth 3 or 4 pounds of bread or 3 or 4 quarts of small beer, end quote. Smith. Here one already encounters all the fundamental assumptions of the traditional Marxist interpretation of value form analysis and the nature of value substance, the starting point in a historically primordial pre-capitalist state in which the means of production still belonged to the immediate producers, and the exchange of their labor products was conducted in a pre-monetary manner, utilizing the empirical, openly manifest measure of value, labor, the constitution of value through labor exertion within the pre-social relationship between man and nature. The empirical equivalence of the internal, true, and external variable measures of value, the development of more complex forms of wealth as a conscious response to the actual problems of socialization inherent in pre-monetary barter trade, including the progression from actually existing, quote, expanded value forms, X meat equals Y beer equals Z bread, etc., toward the more manageable and therefore subsequently adopted general value form, and finally the methodological abstraction from, quote, disturbing contingencies, end quote, and the elucidation of the, quote, logic of a historical process. According to Backhaus, there is indeed, quote, no clarity, end quote, regarding what the conceptual or dialectical derivation of money actually entails. In his view, neither the status of non-empirical laws, especially as, quote, essential laws, nor the relationship between the mode of inquiry and the mode of presentation has been adequately clarified. It is clear, however, that Marx aimed for an, quote, essential definition, end quote, of money. One can see it as a purely logical unfolding of concepts transcending the mere description of historical processes. Backhaus merely hints at what this might imply within his footnotes, drawing upon Klaus Hartmann's exposition regarding the, quote, transcendental, problematic inherent in Marx's theory of value. Hartmann regards Marx's theory of value as transcendental because it does not situate all of its categories, quote, on the same ontological plane, end quote, but rather as a, quote, reconstruction of the economy from principles, end quote, thereby, quote, disclosing a realm of phenomena, end quote. Hartmann openly challenges Engels' historical interpretation of the theory of value, asserting, quote, Engels' conception is a vulgar quote, Engels' conception is a vulgar Marxist, historically representational misunderstanding, end quote. Hartmann. Yet, as Backhaus demonstrates, Hartmann paradoxically remains on the very same, quote, representational plane of a pre-monetary object understanding, for he misconstrues the initial commodity as a, quote, concrete immediate object, end quote. A misinterpretation that corresponds to characterizing the analysis of the value form as a mere description of, quote, historically early stages of the economy, end quote. What Hartmann's analysis ultimately reveals, however, according to Backhaus, is that a pre-monetary commodity, when understood in a realist sense, cannot be further determined, for it exhibits no inherent deficiencies and can only be expanded upon within the medium of, quote, representation, utilizing categories derived from empirical observation. If the commodity itself is reified into an isolated, self-subsistent entity, then, consequently, no imminent development can any longer be discerned, and the sequence of categories can be justified only on didactic grounds. Value, conceived as what Hartmann terms a, quote, principle, that signifies a, quote, transcendental succession of categories which are, in terms of their mode of being, quote, simultaneous, can thus no longer be justified. According to Backhaus, however, with this critique, Hartmann does not target Marx, but rather Marxism. One second. There's a paragraph that I missed here. It's only one sentence back, though. Caught myself. Give me 1 second. One second. Published in 1978, the third installment of the Materials series opens with a revision of the concept of reconstruction employed in the first two volumes. As Backhaus himself notes, in those earlier works he still proceeded from a distinct, quote, two-layer model, one that initially posited a contradiction between a, quote, esoteric Marxian and a, quote, exoteric Marxist conception of subject matter and method, while presuming that any ambiguity in Marxist formulations were merely apparent. Ambiguities within Marx's text, which had served to nourish orthodox interpretations, were construed as the results of a, quote, didactic mishap, end quote. Following a rereading of previously overlooked passages, however, it became necessary on the one hand to focus more intently on the methodological dispute between, quote, logical and, quote, historical readings, and on the other to postulate that, quote, only the recognition of certain ambiguities conveys an adequate picture of Marx's theory of value, end quote. Countering the claims of univocity and conceptual unity advanced by both the old and the new orthodoxies, attention must instead be directed towards the genuine ambivalences and contradictions present within Marx's work, in order to test the hypothesis of a conceptual, rather than merely didactic, quote, uncertainty on Marx's part, end quote. In doing so, Backhaus moves beyond Althusser's thesis, which posits that Marx's scientific revolution was overlaid by an inadequate meta-discourse. Though, unlike the structuralist approach, Backhaus locates this meta-discourse not in Hegelianism, and instead identifies ambivalent and, quote, heterogeneous elements within the substantive analysis presented in Marx's Capital itself. Backhaus speaks of a, quote, stalemate between the contradictory logical and historical methodological approaches within Marx's own work, and identifies in this the fundamental cause of the previously discussed, quote, trialism of Marxist capital interpretations, end quote. While, quote, model Platonist, end quote, and historical approaches thus differ in that the former conceive of pre-monetary acts of exchange as fictional models, typically grounded in utility theory, whereas the latter, historical approaches, proceed from the actual existence of such practices, both nonetheless regard the, quote, natural exchange economy, as the, quote, essence of the monetary economy, end quote. Both conceive of value on the basis of immediate interactions or pre-social human object relations, and neither is able to conceptually develop the connection between the internal measure of value, quote, labor or, quote, utility, and the external measure of value, money as a, quote, abstract unit of account, end quote. For them, the, quote, phenomenon appears merely as a contingently superadded, quote, monetary veil, end quote. According to Backhaus, however, the analysis of the form of value acquires, quote, non-trivial substantive content, end quote, only as a critique of pre-monetary theories of value, the identification and explication of which in turn is possible only on the basis of a logical reception of Marx's work. Marx thus characterizes the concept of a pre-monetary commodity as, quote, unthinkable, and reconstructs the inevitable failure of a, quote, exchange process involving pre-monetary commodities, end quote. The objective here is to demonstrate the fact that, quote, value cannot be conceived as a self-subsistent pre-monetary substance that is externally related to a third entity, namely money, end quote. The laws of such a monetary theory of value are, as the Grundrisse and A Contribution to the Critique demonstrate, according to Backhaus, derived in a manner that is, quote, logical, yet by no means, quote, logical historical, end quote. In Marx's work, particularly within the framework of the analysis of the form of value, one can, however, discern a creeping, quote, process of the, quote, historicization of the, quote, logical, end quote, unquote. Extending from the Grundrisse to the second edition of Capital, this is how to refute the logicist, quote, thesis of univocity, end quote, thereby demonstrating that as far as the textual evidence itself is concerned, quote, the quote, logico-historical, end quote, interpretation of Marx's Capital is not plucked out of thin air, end quote. Backhaus. Yet this interpretation is subsequently deemed untenable. It unerringly sidesteps indications of a logical methodology. It fails even to identify the critical thrust of the analysis of the form of value vis-a-vis bourgeois approaches, as it operates entirely within their terrain, and it fails even to fulfill its own stated objective. For in place of historical investigations into the genesis of money, it offers mere a priori constructions of a putative economic history. The trajectory of development from A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy to the second edition of Marx's Capital must therefore be criticized as a misguided development requiring correction. However, Backhaus makes no attempt to substantively realize this new reconstructive project by engaging with Marx's text. However, at times, almost wearisomely persistent, Backhaus's materials may be in their programmatic focus, his critique of the form taken by the, quote, Neo-Orthodoxy emerging in the first half of the 1970s is equally incisive. To begin with, Backhaus narrows the genesis of the, quote, new reading of Capital, unquote, down to the, quote, circle of the Frankfurt School, end quote, or more precisely to a study group founded in 1964 at the Frankfurt Institute for Political Science, a restriction that is justifiable, if at all, only insofar as it counters the myth that this new reading of Marx emerged in the wake of the student movement. Even Hans-Jürgen Kroll, a student of Adorno and a leading figure in the 1968 revolt, is said to have engaged with Marx's intentions regarding the critique of political economy only on a superficial level. The new mode of reasoning, Backhaus argues, adopts a, quote, ambivalent stance toward Marx and Engels. It positions itself as, quote, orthodox with respect to Marx's critique of political economy, yet, quote, revisionist regarding certain, quote, guiding philosophical concepts, end quote. held by Marx and Engels, a characterization which, incidentally, as demonstrated in Chapter 1 of Part 1, initially applies to Althusser as well. As a, quote, logical interpretation of the critique of political economy, it may thus be aptly termed a, quote, new orthodoxy. Yet from an initially anti-dogmatic impetus, a new dogmatism has now evolved, one that stands as a mirror image of traditional Marxism. Quote, the text of Marx's Capital is held to be sacrosanct, whereas its century-long history of reception is regarded as the history of a monumental error unleashed upon the world by Engels, Lenin, and others. End quote. Among the elements of this neo-orthodoxy deemed open to criticism are first and foremost its, quote, thesis of univocality, quote, and the, quote, thesis of dissent, quote, that logically follows from it. Marx, it is claimed, articulated his logical method with absolute clarity and precision, whereas Engels and others completely misunderstood it. The underlying cause for this alleged misunderstanding, however, remains shrouded in obscurity. This, it is argued, implies a, quote, naive self-deception, quote. The claim, in contrast to tradition, that one has studied Marx with greater intensity. The break with a, quote, history of reception and pedagogical tradition spanning more than 70 years, quote. Insofar as it is reflected upon at all, is explained solely through the supposed immediacy of this new reading of the text. Yet according to Backhaus, the hermeneutic claims of unity, univocity, and immediacy advanced by the, quote, Marxist Lutherans, quote, stand in glaring contradiction to their systematic omission of, and failure to engage with, those disconcerting historicist passages found within Marx's text. They are, he suggests, quote, occasionally not all that scrupulous regarding, quote, the word, quote, unquote. Ultimately, the very legitimacy of reflecting upon the validity of Marx's assertions is contested, whether through the argument that methodological and substantive issues are inextricably intertwined, through mere articles of faith, or even through simplistic attributions based on class origin. The result, therefore, consists of, quote, forms of group Marxism, quote, that are, quote, politically and intellectually hermetically sealed, quote. Moments that are bound to lead to the, quote, discrediting of any scholarly engagement with Marx, quote. End quote. Backhaus. One second. Finally, Backhaus's reflection on the political implications of the reception of value form analysis also merits special attention. Drawing upon Marxian value theory, much as Kittsteiner had done a year earlier, quote, socialist commodity production, quote, is characterized as a, quote, non-concept, quote. Marx, it is argued, conceives not merely of surplus value, but of the value form per se, as historically specific, and explains value, price, and money as arising from the, quote, contradiction between private and social labor, end quote. Were this contradiction to be abolished, it could signify nothing other than the abolition of those very forms. According to Backhaus, therefore, their systematic persistence is in no way reconcilable with the Marxian approach. Since these forms are demonstrably present in, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, even while it is simultaneously claimed that a, quote, planned economic coordination of individual labors, end quote, exists. Backhaus concludes that one is left with only two options: either to regard Marxist value theory as falsified, or to posit the existence of such contradictory conditions of socialization even within, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote. A move which, however, would necessitate a redefinition of the concept of, quote, private labor, such that, quote, individual labors within cooperatively organized planned economies could also be subsumed under it, end quote. Backhaus. Backhaus himself, in opposition to the legitimizing conceptual acrobatics of Marxist-Leninism, postulates instead that the, quote, Engelsian or left-Ricardian, quote, timesheet doctrine, end quote, constitutes the, quote, essential content of Marxist form analysis, end quote. What? That's a weird sentence. Backhaus himself, in opposition to the postulates instead that, quote, the Engelsian or left-Ricardian, quote, timesheet doctrine, end quote, constitutes the quote, essential content of Marxist form analysis, end quote. Okay, no, that's right. It seems like the correct translation. Backhaus himself, in opposition to the legitimizing conceptual acrobatics of Marxist-Leninism, postulates instead that the, quote, Engelsian or left-Ricardian, quote, timesheet doctrine, end quote, constituting the, quote, essential content of Marxist form analysis, end quote. Whether in juxtaposing the calculation of labor quantities in planned economies on the one hand with the illegitimate theory of a, quote, socialist commodity form, end quote, on the other, Backhaus does not himself fall prey to an ontologization of the concept of, quote, value substance is a question we shall examine in greater detail in the context of the debate surrounding the concept of, quote, abstract labor. It is only in the fourth part, dating from 1978/79 and remaining published until 1997, that Backhaus formulates his initial, albeit still sketchy, approach towards a critically reconstructive engagement with the text of Marx and Engels. He proceeds from the premise that Marx's rough draft of 1857/58 represents the, quote, logical pole of this methodological conception, while Engels' addendum to the third volume of Marx's Capital represents the, quote, historical pole. However, Backhaus argues that the logical and historical procedure should by no means, as claimed by orthodox interpretations, be described as the poles of a dialectical relationship. Rather, he characterizes them as being logically mutually exclusive. Backhaus then meticulously traces the stages of Engels' reception of Marx's writings, interpreting his, quote, misunderstandings and distortions, end quote, simultaneously as both a, quote, distorting mirror and a, quote, magnifying glass, devices through which real ambiguities within Marx's work can be identified. Alongside this, however, Backhaus also discovers two anti-historicist methodological reflections on Marx's critique, penned by Engels himself, within the study notes of the first edition of Capital. In these notes, the initial commodity is conceptualized using the Hegelian turn of phrase, quote, commodity in itself, end quote. Backhaus's affirmative observations regarding the problematic nature of a monetary theory of value in Marx's work remain rather cursory. Drawing upon the operatic value form 4 of the first edition, which serves in turn as an application of the proposition that a commodity cannot simultaneously occupy both the relative value form and the equivalent form within the same expression of value, as well as upon the depiction of the failure of pre-monetary commodity exchange at the beginning of the second chapter. Backhaus formulates the thesis that in the quote esoteric section of Marx's Capital, Marx's objective is to demonstrate the quote inconceivability of a pre-monetary commodity, or more precisely of the quote exchange process of pre-monetary commodities, end quote. Since it is only through the relation of all commodities to money that they can relate to one another as values, a point Marx clearly articulated as late as the second edition of Marx's Capital. The quote actual commodity is always merely the price-determined commodity, or alternatively, the money commodity, end quote. The commodity, quote, in itself, appearing at the beginning of the exposition, can therefore be understood only as a conceptually underdetermined commodity within a commodity-money relation. An exchange without money, as the second edition also points out, is conceivable solely as a, quote, exchange of products, not of commodities. Over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, a number of studies, mostly with explicit reference to Backhaus, addressed Marx's theory of value as a critique of pre-monetary value theory. However, the line of argument outlined in the fourth part of the materials is developed in particular in the works of Helmut Brentel and Michael Heinrich, and will be systematically elucidated in what follows. Yet it will only become apparent during a subsequent pass through the discussion, specifically regarding the question of the relationship between the analysis of the form of value and the concept of money. Whether the radicalized conception of reconstruction introduced by Backhaus in the fourth part, following Habermas, plays a meaningful role in engaging with Marx's work and the substantive problems contained therein. Nevertheless, it can already be stated that at this juncture that Backhaus's concept of reconstruction, which following Frieder Otto Wolff might be termed, quote, formalistic, actually departs from the terrain of a critique of popularization and indeed from that of reconstruction itself. For this concept suggests that one should no longer proceed from the assumption of consistent patterns of argumentation existing and reconstructible within Marx's work, or of overlapping and intermingling discourses. Rather, it proposes using other theoretical means to reconfigure fragments drawn from the critique of political economy, in order to resolve the problems formulated therein. It is no coincidence that Backhaus's radicalized concept of reconstruction, which is in reality a concept of construction, originates with Jürgen Habermas, who similarly undertook a, quote, reconstruction of historical materialism by employing approaches derived from systems theory, cognitive developmental psychology, and speech act theory. Helmut Brentel's contribution may be regarded as one of the most elaborate attempts to explicate the substance of Marx's analysis of forms. This is accomplished through a clarification of the concept of value as form, as well as a detailed reconstruction oriented simultaneously towards both Hans-Georg Backhaus and Dieter Wolff of the monetary intentions underlying the analysis of the form of value. Brentl begins by discussing a, quote, dual usage of the term, quote, law of value in Marx. The, quote, superhistorical, quote, value law, end quote, he argues, denotes the social character of concrete activities in societies organized around a division of labor, specifically the material interdependence of various labors and proportional distribution of total social labor across individual spheres of production. It is only in this sense as a law governing the general imperatives of socialization inherent in a divided labor economy, as well as the proportional distribution of that labor, that one can, according to Brentl, speak of a, quote, content or, quote, essence, distinct from the historically specific, quote, form or, quote, mode of appearance of this socialization. Even though Brentl adopts, or indeed intensifies, Marx's somewhat infelicitous terminology, he nonetheless clarifies that this, quote, content, in the sense just described, is absolutely distinct from the category of, quote, value substance, end quote. The latter, he contends, must itself be understood as a, quote, form, specifically as the historically specific mode in which concrete labors are socialized. At the level of the historically specific, Brentl distinguishes three, quote, form dimensions, end quote. The, quote, capitalist social form, end quote, form 3, denotes the universal form of privately organized, divided labor production that emerges from the class relation between capital and wage labor. It establishes the conditions for the socialization of labor as an antagonistic, quote, fundamental economic form, end quote. A specific contradictory mode in which labor is posited as something that must first be mediated in order to constitute total social labor. From this fundamental premise, the, quote, substance, quote, objectivity, and, quote, form of value now derive, specifically, value, substance, and value as its, quote, objectivity, form 1, serving as the specific mode of mediation for dissociated private labors or products, and representing the, quote, form of unity of social labor under conditions of its systematic divergence, end quote, as well as the necessarily objective mode of existence of this, quote, objectivity, the value form, form 2, namely money. Brentl defines form analysis as the explanation of the constitution of value, form 1 as the mediating form of isolated private products, and of its forms. Its objective modes of existence in the sense of form 2 derive from the specific contradictory conditions of the socialization of labor, form 3. Thus it serves as the deciphering of forms that appear thing-like, revealing them as forms of social synthesis under historically specific conditions. From Brentl's expositions, it is thus possible to compile a small catalog of specified formal concepts, or rather their conceptual correlates. Social form 1, a historically specific mode of the social interconnection of laborers and laborers. In this respect, both the substance of value and its product, value itself, constitute a social form. Social form 2, the historically specific mode of existence of social form 1, its objective representation in the value forms, forms of value, in parentheses. Formal determinacy 1, the historically specific structural determinacy of a content, e.g. the structure of an action, the social property of an object. Formal determinacy 2, the determination of the form of wealth by its ground, an underlying production relation in the sense of the condition of the socialization of labor. The form, as a simple one, can appear as simple only by virtue of a really presupposed, more complex relation. Form content, not the how, but the what of socialization. In the case of the form value, Use value is that which is socialized through value. The form content may itself be shaped by the form, e.g., the process of labor under real subsumption, or, as in the case of the legal form, it may be a content that is itself a form with a specific content, namely an economic relation, the form of which is then constituted by the legal form and regulates it. Substance, the historically specific process that produces the form, e.g., value. Social form 3/basis. Historically, specific modes of socialization of labor, which place the acts of labor or the products of labor into a relationship that is to be mediated by a specific form. 1. Under capitalism, the separation of the immediate producers from the means of production and of privately isolated production units from one another, a separation that is mediated by value is form 1, and by its form of existence, form 2. In a manner that reproduces this very separation. Let me repeat that last sentence. Under capitalism, the separation of the immediate producers from the means of production and of privately isolated production units from one another, a separation that is mediated by value is form 1, and by its forms of existence 2, in a manner that reproduces this very separation. Regarding Marx's treatment of the compulsion towards socialization inherent in the division of labor, a compulsion not specific to any particular social formation, Brentel's observation is of interest. He suggests that this implies a, quote, ideal equilibrium statement regarding the overall reproduction of social units, end quote. Unfortunately, this line of thought is not pursued any further, for in doing so questions arise, questions that could just as well be directed at a systems theory of society and its objective of the self-preservation of systemic units. To the best of my knowledge, these questions raised, for instance, by Habermas or Giddens, are merely touched upon within the Marxist context by Helmut Reichelt alone. Yet anything resembling a discussion of these questions, namely, which, quote, unit is it that preserves itself, and what constitutes the criterion for, quote, self-preservation in relation to the, quote, natural law of social production, end quote, postulated by Marx is entirely absent, even in rudimentary form. Well, one might, following Reichelt, formulate the thesis that an objective criterion for self-reproduction can be identified only in the case of capitalist social formations, specifically the intertemporal persistence of value as a form-specific criterion of social synthesis. How then is this possible for societies that have not organized their mode of production largely outside the realm of norm-regulated interactions? That is to say, within a, quote, embedded sphere. In context, not only is, quote, bare survival, end quote, impossible to define, but the very maintenance of existence is moreover inextricably bound to normative patterns of interpretation, presumably those of ruling powers. Does then a form of crypto-normativism surreptitiously insinuate itself into Marx's discourse on the, quote, masses of products corresponding to various masses of needs, end quote, products which in turn, quote, call for various quantitatively determined masses of total social labor, end quote, whose needs precisely are being referred to here? Is the criterion of proportionality tailored to all members of society? Which needs specifically are at issue? Is it merely those needs driven by the desire to avoid, quote, perishing miserably, end quote? One might attempt to formulate this transformational phenomenon in an unproblematic manner. What would remain, in my view, is firstly, the inherent imperative towards socialization in any division of labor-based production, and secondly, the existence of specific quantities of needs, products, and labor that stand in a mutually proportional relationship, determinable ex post. Conversely, the problematic assumption is that the purpose of social reproduction, regardless of its specific form, is the, quote, preservation of, quote, society through the satisfaction of its individuals' needs. Dieter Voss remarks regarding the historically non-specific structure of the socialization of labor serve as a prime example of this. Quote, in the proportional distribution of social labor, the total labor time available is invariably allocated among the individual branches of production in such a way that the reciprocal satisfaction of needs is guaranteed, end quote. Yet here too Marx's dictum ought to apply, quote, to view society as a single subject is moreover to view it falsely, end quote. End quote, Marx. Brentel now develops a detailed critique of Engels' theorem of simple commodity production. According to this account, Marx distinguishes on the one hand between immediately and mediatedly socialized labor, whereby only the latter relates to organizational forms based on a private division of labor by means of a specific economic objectivity, and on the other hand is a differentiation within the concept of indirect sociality between pre-capitalist and universalized commodity exchange. As, quote, minimal conditions, end quote, for the former, Marx identifies in Capital Volume 3 of Capital, among other things, the continuous exchange of systematically interrelated surplus products and the absence of monopolies. Regardless of questions regarding the historical validity of these criteria, however, Brentel argues that it is a completely different category that has shaped the Marxist discussion concerning the scope of the category of value. Engels' concept of, quote, simple commodity production, a concept that conflates Marx's distinctions. For Engels, it is argued, imbues the concept of pre-capitalist commodity production with, quote, the meaning of immediate socialization, quote, effected through conscious calculations of labor quantities. The, quote, simple element within the concept of, quote, simple commodity production thus stands equally for the transparency and surveyability of the social nexus, and for the empirical obviousness and perceptibility of its regulating principle. Value determination by means of labor time. In doing so, according to Brentel, Engels lends a, quote, empiricist character, end quote, to Marxian concepts that were originally intended to describe a total societal nexus not empirically graspable. The theory of value determination based on socially necessary or average labor time, and on the, quote, all-sided relation of products to total social labor, end quote, is thereby transformed into a theory of value formation based on subjective, pre-social labor pain. Moreover, the problem of reduction regarding the comparability or the comparability of qualitatively, although I said or the same pronunciation. Let me repeat this whole sentence of like that. Anyway. The theory of value determination based on socially necessary or average labor time and on the, quote, all-sided relation of products to total social labor, end quote, is thereby transformed into a theory of value formation based on subjective, pre-social labor pain. Moreover, the problem of reduction regarding the comparability of qualitatively distinct forms of labor is completely elided. According to Brentel, the transition from a posited pre-monetary commodity exchange to a calculation in terms of commodity quanta remains not only obscure. Engels' theses also contradict all of Marx's assertions regarding the impossibility of such a commodity exchange, as well as the actors' lack of awareness regarding the source of commodities exchangeability. According to Marx, the social character of commodities becomes apparent to producers only within the act of exchange. That is, in the subjective phenomenal forms of, quote, exchange value or money. They calculate solely in terms of money, a commodity that functions per se as a social form, and do not equate their commodities as values simply, quote, because these things appear to them merely as the material receptacles of homogeneous human labor. The converse is true. By equating their diverse products to one another as values in the act of exchange, they equate their diverse forms of labor to one another as human labor. They do not know this, but they do it. Hence, the nature of value is not inscribed upon its forehead. End quote. According to Brentel, a point that will further be clarified below, Marx's critique of political economy demonstrates that the assumption of empirically concrete labor as value forming stands in contradiction to the conditions of socialization based on the private division of labor, which constitute the sole basis for value formation. Consequently, commodities are always only indirectly social in nature, and their exchange can invariably take place only through the medium of money. According to Brentel, therefore, Marx posits only two possibilities, either monetarily mediated commodity exchange or pre-economic reciprocity of goods mediated by norms or force. It is already evident here that consequently, a socialization of labor through its conscious measurement via reduction to simple labor time never actually takes place. Yet at first glance, Marx appears to imply precisely this in the so-called, quote, fetishism section of the first volume of Capital. However, according to Brentel, the fiction of labor time calculation within the framework of non-commodity based production relations serves merely as a methodological device, a mode of explication for the labor theory of value. Marx, quote, illustrates a, quote, measurement of labor in terms of time by means of a posited fictitious averaging process in contexts where in reality no, quote, measurement of labor and no averaging actually occur, since every specific labor is already immediately social. He does this in order to render intelligible the averaging process that does occur in reality, but which as a total societal relation is no longer intuitively transparent, precisely because it is not being, quote, measured, end quote. In this context, referring to Robinson's, quote, economy of time, end quote, the conscious allocation of his workday, the feudal mode of production, whereby labor is socialized as payments in kind, and the patriarchal subsistence economy, where labor constitutes direct family functions, Marx thus characterizes the allocation of labor as, in a sense, a form of measurement. According to Brentel, however, labor derives its social form from its determination by directly hierarchical institutions. The proportional distribution of labor across individual branches of production and of goods among consumers is regulated a priori through political institutional means, quote, not through their arithmetical equality or their equation in terms of time. ... Labor is allocated as unequal labor. According to time, it is not, quote, measured as equal labor in terms of time, end quote. In doing so, he contradicts common assertions that abstract labor performs a socializing function in even pre-capitalist communities. Furthermore, as he explicitly states, Marx posits a distribution of labor and means of consumption based on labor time for the, quote, association of free individuals, end quote, only, quote, by way of analogy with commodity production, end quote. If in particular this latter example is misinterpreted as a realistic model, it gives rise to the notion of concrete labor time accounting as a mode of socialization, a notion that implies a conflation of fundamentally opposed ways in which labor is socialized. Brentel is thus the first author to cast a critical eye based on a monetary theory of value upon this section of the fetish chapter, putting out the possibility of a, quote, uncomplicated misunderstanding, end quote, of the analogies, quote, strained therein. The critique of Engels already formulated by Backhaus and Kittsteiner is thereby, quote, deepened. Furthermore, the notion of a socialist calculation of labor quantities is criticized as a first step towards the ontologization of the value form. Against this background, however, his assessment of Marx's theses regarding the, quote, first phase of communism, end quote, as present in the critique of the Gotha program is striking, for he interprets them as evidence of a Marxian critique of quasi-Proudhonist conceptualizations of the socialization of labor under socialism. Yet on the contrary, Marx here advocates a, quote, timesheet model, albeit without the assumption of continued commodity production. At this juncture, and in contrast to Marx, Brentel points out the seemingly insoluble problem of reduction, the application of the model of equivalence understood as an averaging principle, to quote, measurement operations applied to individual labor, end quote, is, he argues, not only a senseless operation within non-commodity relations, but also leads to, quote, scarcely solvable problems regarding the just valuation, end quote, of concrete forms of labor. Moreover, Marx himself is said to have criticized this mode of distribution as a repressive principle of equality, distribution proportional to, quote, performance. However, that might be measured, fails to take into account the unequal physical and psychological constitution of the individuals engaged in labor, and is therefore, like all forms of right, a, quote, right of inequality, end quote. Ultimately, Marx's aim is to decouple the individual's share of the social product from any principles lying outside the realm of individual need. However, when Brentel suggests that Marx thereby conceives of concrete labor time, accounting as a, quote, morally reprehensible, possibly unavoidable, but in any case also fictitious transitional stage of a communist society, end quote, then at least the latter two aspects constitute a contradiction. Either concrete labor time accounting is a mode of social synthesis, is an impossible and senseless undertaking, not only within forms of indirect socialization, but also within those of immediate socialization, or it is, quote, possibly unavoidable, end quote, yet, quote, morally reprehensible, end quote. Okay. Brentel's distinction between, quote, measuring labor in terms of time and, quote, allocating labor according to time is in substance already present in Wolfgang Müller's review of Ernst Mandel's Marxist economic theory. Mandel attempts to provide ethnological support for Engels' theorem of, quote, simple commodity production, conceived as a concept of pre-monetary exchange based on the direct calculation of labor quantities. Admittedly, Müller does not explicitly point out the anachronistic or contradictory nature of Mandel's argumentation. Mandel cites as an example of simple commodity production functioning as a form of socialization achieved through, quote, accounting in labor hours, end quote, the determination of, quote, wages for various types of work and specific quantities of barley. As in the case with Engels, the, quote, reduction problem, the notion that 1 hour of skilled labor equals n plus 1 hours of unskilled labor, is completely glossed over in this context, even though just a few pages later, it is acknowledged as a valid factor in simple commodity production. Incidentally, and again, just as with Engels, this is accomplished through arguments rooted in the, quote, labor disutility theory, end quote. given the premise that the discussion is meant to focus exclusively on empirically self-evident phenomena. Furthermore, the fact that, quote, measurement actually takes place in terms of a third medium, money, serving as an external standard of value, rather than in labor time, leads Mandel to a mysterious ad hoc solution. He claims that the equivalence of qualitatively distinct forms of labor is, quote, immediately recognized as such, end quote, even in the absence of any conscious awareness of, quote, abstract human labor, end quote. Socialization achieved through labor quantity calculations, yet without actual labor quantity calculations, and the simultaneous equal and unequal valuation of disparate forms of labor, such as the paradoxical outcome of Mandel's line of reasoning. Returning to Mueller, he, however, sharply criticizes Mandel's ontologization of the law of value. In this approach, he argues, the exchange of accidental products is reinterpreted as an exchange of commodities of equal value, and even the classification of labor within communities not organized by a private division of labor is determined by the, quote, general criterion of, quote, the calculation of labor time, end quote. Mueller counters this by arguing that, at most, what exists here is a reciprocity of immediately useful labor hours, end quote. That is, of qualitatively distinct forms of labor, which in their natural form are regarded as immediately communal. The, quote, ritually solidified arrangement of useful labors, end quote, implies precisely no disregard for their specific utility and heterogeneity. Thus, to borrow Brentel's phrasing, these labors are classified according to time as unequal labors. Total labor allocated according to a plan and without any calculation of value or labor quantity remains, quote, a totality of various individual labors, end quote. Despite his meta-theoretical commitment to the historical interpretation, he further takes issue with Mandel's conventionalist theory regarding the genesis of money, a theory which, in his view, places Mandel squarely within the tradition of the bourgeois political economy criticized by Marx. In contrast, Mueller emphasizes the necessity of the objective representation of value, specifically as the, quote, necessity of a commodity serving as money, end quote. Following the debates of the 1970s, Brentel now reconstructs Marx's critique as a critique of pre-monetary value theory. In the reductionist conception of the object of political economy, commodity exchange is conceptualized according to the pattern of immediate transparent interactions, specifically the moneyless exchange of products, barter. In such a theory of the objective nature of economic phenomena, the simple form of value is realistically and thus erroneously interpreted by contrast. Marx deciphers it as the most abstract and conceptually undeveloped expression of the money form. Indeed, in the additions and alterations to the first edition of Marx's Capital, which Brentel does not address here, Marx writes unequivocally, quote, both the simple and the expanded forms of value are merely the preparatory stages in the development of the real form of value, end quote. The sequence of the value forms represents here the, quote, elaboration of the always already monetary content, end quote, of the concept of value, a process which simultaneously attests to the fact that economic objects cannot be grounded in a pre-monetary manner. At the outset of the analysis, abstract labor constitutes, quote, initially for us merely an analytical level, end quote, a purely non-objective spectral objectivity that remains suspended in mid-air. It can be fixed only through the mental acts of abstraction performed by scientific consciousness, and thus, at this level of exposition, still exists merely as a, quote, mental construct. Its real abstraction within the commodity relation, as well as its necessary empirical mode of existence, remains yet to be theoretically developed. The demonstration of this, quote, inner necessary connection, end quote, between value substance and value form is, in opposition to political economy, which conceives of this relationship as merely contingent and external, the central objective of the analysis of the value form. This constitutive connection, the fact that the value form must be developed out of the concept of value, is, according to Brentel, indeed, quote, translated into a popularizing metaphoric, end quote, in the second edition of Marx's Capital, e.g. the term, quote, commodity language, end quote, yet is substantively retained. In the simple value form, it becomes evident that the value of commodity A must necessarily express itself in the use value of commodity B, that it cannot be represented solely through A itself, and that one and the same commodity cannot function simultaneously as both relative value form and equivalent form. Conversely, were an individual commodity able to represent its value in and through itself, a paradox would arise. It would constitute both use value and value in the very same respect, and private labor would simultaneously be social labor, and vice versa. Furthermore, it becomes clear that it is only the actual commodity relation, specifically, as will be shown, the universal relation of interdependence mediated by money, that affects the reduction to the immanent measure of value, abstract labor. Abstract labor as a social form is thus a, quote, result in the making, end quote, within the process of exchange, a result which at the same time is logically presupposed by that very exchange as its enabling condition. Thus, the twofold thrust of the analysis of the form of value is revealed. On the one hand, directed against circular explanations of economic objectivity, its recourse to abstract labor, quote, as a non-value-based constitutive foundation, end quote. On the other hand, directed against substantialist identifications of private and social, concrete and abstract labor, as well as of immanent and external measures of value, its recourse to the necessity of objective external forms of existence for value. Both aspects, it is argued, come to light in the discourse concerning the ultimately general form of value as a necessary expression of value. According to Brentel, Marx's constitutive theory of value is thus a theory of the, quote, equally primordial positing relation, of form and substance, end quote. Since it is only within exchange that concrete labors are reduced to abstract labor, value as a, quote, specifically social dimension, end quote, of private products is thus analytically presupposed, quote, for us, and in reality, in a temporal empirical sense, posited within the exchange process. According to Brentel, the concept of value is characterized by a, quote, dual status of positing and presupposition, end quote. As entities produced within and constitutive of capitalism, private labors and products, quote, by no means already constitute general labor. They are such only potentially or, quote, latently, end quote, Brentel. The actual equation of labors, serving as the unifying moment for otherwise privately dissociated activities, takes place, quote, only at the moment of exchange, end quote. For this reason, abstract labor is always already to be understood as, quote, form-determined substance, end quote. Quote, there is no substance, quote, before the form, end quote. According to Brentel, however, value is not merely separable from a form of value. Above all, it cannot be grounded without a specific form of value. The commensurability argument, based on the qualitative ground of utility, that alone enables commodities to enter into a quantitative relationship at all, must therefore be linked to the argument regarding form in a more specific manner. The explanation of the, quote, inner necessary connection, end quote, between value and the general form of value now entails demonstrating the, quote, apparatics of merely simple forms of value, end quote. 1 second. Thus the aporia of both the simple or accidental value form, the representation of the value of commodity A in some particular use value of commodity B, arbitrarily selected by the theorist, which thereby functions as a singular equivalent, and the expanded value form, the representation of the value of A in an infinite series of different commodities, thereby function as particular equivalents of A, lies in the contradiction between the concept of value and the form of value. Quote, the qualitative equality of commodities can exist only through and in their expression of value. Then this expression must also be a general expression. If an equality transcending all concrete labors is to be actually constituted within it, end quote. Because the actual equalization takes place in exchange, according to Brentel, quote, the positing of their equality as a form must be a generally valid form, end quote. Marx, Brentel notes, encapsulates this in the category of the deficiencies of the non-general value forms. One, in the simple value form, e.g. 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat. There exists no representation of value, that is, of the social unity of private products, that would actually enable exchange. The distinction between value and use value applies to only one commodity. The value of the linen appears in the guise of a coat, and merely the equality of two specific commodities is expressed therein. In this context, only the coat is immediately exchangeable in relation to linen. In the expanded value form, e.g. 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, 10 kilos of iron, 1 liter of wine, etc., the value of the linen possesses no unified form of appearance. Here only particular equivalents exist, equivalents that, in their representation of abstract general labor, mutually cancel one another out. According to Brentel, it is only within the general relation of all commodities to one and the same, excluded equivalent commodity, that an objective empirical mode of existence of abstract labor, a quote, abstract form existence, end quote, is established. Thereby, quote, non-values, non-monetary elements, namely labor, are constituted in a unified act as valorum, and monetary elements as value and exchange value, end quote. Value as the socially general form of a non-social, particular content, use value, cannot, and this is the crux of the argument, adequately express itself, quote, in accordance with its concept, end quote, in the form of a non-social particular equivalent. An equivalent for merely a single commodity yields no equivalent for all commodities. Likewise, having as many equivalents as there are commodities yields no universally valid equivalent. To posit any given commodity as money presupposes an identity between use value and value, between private labor and socially recognized labor, which is impossible under conditions of private division of labor based production, since the very separateness defines them, yet which would be senseless under conditions of immediately communal production, since the social character of labor in such a context does not constitute itself as value or in value forms. Marx draws particular attention to this central aspect of his value theory, above all in the first edition of Marx's Capital, by emphasizing that immediate exchangeability is a property neither of commodities per se, nor immediately of money. The analysis of the value form simultaneously demonstrates the mediated immediacy of immediate exchangeability, a quality that accrues to one and the same commodity only within the framework of a specific function and a specific value relation, and the dependence of mediated exchangeability upon immediate exchangeability. Commodities can possess value only in relation to an excluded money commodity. According to Marx, the forms of, quote, immediate exchangeability and non-immediate exchangeability. Commodities can possess value only in relation to an excluded money commodity. According to Marx, the forms of, quote, immediate exchangeability. Sorry, let me repeat that lesson. I fucked that up. Analysis of the value form simultaneously demonstrates the mediated immediacy of immediate exchangeability, a quality that accrues to one and the same commodity only within the framework of a specific function and a specific value relation, and the dependence of mediated exchangeability upon immediate exchangeability. Commodities can possess value only in relation to an excluded money commodity. According to Marx, the forms of, quote, immediate exchangeability and, quote, non-immediate exchangeability are, quote, just as inseparable as the positivity of one magnetic pole is from the negativity of the other, unquote. Thus, Marx's theory of value presents itself as a monetary theory, one which, in contrast to all other positions in political economy, including those Marxist variants grounded in Engels, posit an internal mutually constitutive connection between value and money. Here, too, the development of the form constitutes the elaboration of the necessary, more complex preconditions for what appears to be simple. It demonstrates the failure to constitute economic objectivity within simple relations, and invokes a successive further determination achieved by exposing the aporias and deficiencies inherent in pre-monetary exchange. The standard of reference here is the concept of value itself, along with its, quote, demands regarding the equation of commodities as values, that is, as things possessing a common unified social substance. Consequently, this concept of value serves as a valid description of the basis of social exchange relations only by virtue of the universal social relations obtaining between all commodities and money. The transition to the initially adequate mode of existence for value is an imminent one, in that it is achieved through a mere inversion of the expanded form of value. It is only within the general form of value that commodities express their values, quote, 1, simply because in a single commodity, and 2, uniformly because in the same commodity. Their form of value is simple and common, hence it is general, end quote. Only at this stage, according to Brentel, is the, quote, level of reality of the form of value, end quote, truly attained. If, as Marx asserts, it is only this form that genuinely relates commodities to one another as values, then, as Brentel concludes, the simple form of value is, quote, always already a movement of the general form of value, and to that extent merely an abstraction thereof. Alternatively, if this simple form is posited as an independently existing reality, it does not, in fact, designate actual value expressions, but rather subjectively contingent, non-interdependent exchange relations, end quote. This observation is also found in the second chapter of Capital, a chapter criminally neglected by Orthodox scholarship. Brentel, however, also notes that, quote, real here still counts a premature characterization, given that the, quote, general equivalent form, end quote, situated at the level of exposition of the value form analysis, and the, quote, real general equivalent, end quote, are not, quote, the same thing, are, quote, not the same thing, end quote. Consequently, the actual, quote, first level of reality, end quote, of economic forms is attained only in the third chapter, with the exchange of price-determined commodities for money. Fuck. Hold on. As a dialectical logic, the logic of the value form analysis exhibits a specific contradictory structure, one that Brentel endeavors to elucidate in close adherence to Dieter Wolff's publication on commodities and money. Consequently, both studies are taken into account in what follows, with Brentel's more concise exposition serving as the guiding thread. Brentel begins by making a meta-theoretical distinction between logical contradictions and dialectical contradictions. While logical contradictions refer to real-world conditions, dialectical contradictions are to be found only within statements. However, the linguistic representation of dialectical contradictions necessitates, quote, formal contradictions, end quote, without thereby dissolving into logical contradictions. According to Brentel, Marx subsequently introduces the determinations of the commodity as a, quote, real contradiction, end quote. The distinct properties of use value and value are opposing characteristics, resulting from the specific conditions of production relations characterized by a private division of labor. Here, quote, privately dissociated labor must be synthesized into the unity of total social labor, end quote. Consequently, labor is, quote, determined in different and indeed opposing ways, end quote. That is, in order to gain recognition, it must present itself as, quote, its immediate opposite, as abstract general labor, end quote. According to Brentel, use value and value thus impose conflicting demands on the commodity. To realize itself as use value, an event that occurs only during consumption by the buyer, and to realize itself as value, an event that takes place solely through sale. Yet for the commodity qua commodity, these two determinations, quote, cannot be realized simultaneously, end quote. Following Wolff, the commodity is now defined as a dialectical contradiction. 1. The necessary interconnection of use value and value consists in the fact that a product can possess value only as the result of useful concrete labor, that it must constitute potential use value for others in order to become a recognized component of the total social product within production relations characterized by a private division of labor, and conversely, that it can realize its use value only if it simultaneously reveals itself as value for its owner. Yet the use value and value of the commodity simultaneously tend to diverge and, quote, become autonomous vis-a-vis one another, end quote, because the social dimension of the commodity, quote, cannot possess a distinct form of existence of its own, end quote, within its own natural form. The value of commodity A, social form 1, must manifest itself in the form of commodity B, which thereby advances to become social form 2, and in doing so it becomes autonomous relative to the use value of A. Die erste Stufe der Verselbstständigung des Werts, der Übergang von der Ware zur Wertform, der von Backhaus aus Bruch. I don't know why I'm reading that. Sorry, I'm spaced out for a second. I started reading because I'm have the German right up here in front of me so I make sure I'm not missing paragraphs. But I spaced out. Anyway, the first stage of the autonomization of value, the transition from the commodity to the value form, which Backhaus viewed as a rupture in the dialectical exposition, is, however, expounded by Wolff in great detail as a necessary transition. In doing so, it is demonstrated the social character of commodities,
the commodity's value dimension can manifest itself only within the objectivity of that social character, specifically in the use-value dimension of other commodities. According to Wolff, this is grounded not only in the purely social mode of existence of value, but also in the specific manner in which the social character of objects is expressed. Quote, since the value of an individual commodity cannot appear in any medium distinct from its own use value, for the commodity is an inanimate object possessing neither gestures nor language, etc., value cannot appear in the commodity at all. The commodity is apprehensible not as a social entity distinct from its use value, but solely and exclusively as a use value. If the commodity must appear as value, and if it can do so in no medium other than that of use value, then the commodity can appear only within a use value that is distinct from the commodity's own use value. End quote. Wolff. According to Wolff, only human beings, in their existence as social beings, are capable of developing and utilizing for one another a medium distinct from their own immediate physical materiality. The social character of human beings, he argues, manifests itself in them in the form of gestures, sounds, and spoken and written language. No human being is thereby excluded or reduced to their mere corporeality as the sole form of their social general existence. Yet Wolff contends this is precisely what occurs with commodities as specifically social objects. Under conditions of private, socially divided production, the actors now enter into contact with one another objectively, mediated through the exchange of their products. Quote, the social relation of human beings is mediated through the social relation of things. Okay. The socialization of their own labor confronts human beings as something autonomous, in the form of a social relation of things, and their social unity appears autonomously as a value property of their labor products. A, quote, social relation of things implies here that these objects are placed by human beings under specific conditions into a relationship wherein they acquire a function or property extending beyond their mere physical materiality, a materiality they possess even in isolation. Yet, as Marx emphasized, quote, commodities are things. Whatever commodities are, they must be objectively, or demonstrate themselves to be, within their own objective relations, end quote. Indeed, Marx repeatedly and clearly drew attention to this aspect, the representation of value within the relation of commodities to one another. In this context, the very metaphor of a, quote, commodity language mentioned by Brentel points to a substantive insight. While value as the invisible social dimension of unity underlying private products can initially be grasped by theorists only in thought, such conceptualization is impossible within the social reality of unconscious socialization, a reality in which calculations based on value are precisely not employed. As such, calculations would presuppose direct coordinated socialization. Essentially, labor products, quote, cannot be expressed as values, end quote, but, quote, not as values, end quote. By, quote, not as values, end quote. It is meant that they cannot appear immediately as values. Rather, they must do so via the, quote, detour of the use value of a specific commodity, one singled out to serve as the general equivalent. According to Wolff, this social dimension does not, in and of itself, encounter a pre-existing social medium, in the way that human beings encounter language. Therefore, a distinct form of symbolizing this social nexus comes into being, the, quote, commodity language, the, quote, language of things, through which the very concepts previously articulated by the theorist in thought must now be expressed, quote, without brains, end quote. Thus, social objects can express their specifically social character only, once again, in an objective form, in that a thing represents or embodies this sociality. Quote, one sees that everything the analysis of commodity value previously told us is articulated by the linen itself, so soon as it enters into circulation with another commodity, the coat. Yet it reveals its thoughts only in the language familiar to it alone, the language of commodities. To say that labor in its abstract quality as human labor constitutes labor's own value. It states that the coat, let me repeat that sentence, or the last two sentences. Thus, social objects can express their specifically social character only, once again, in an objective form, in that a thing represents or embodies this sociality. Quote, one sees that everything the analysis of commodity value previously told us is articulated by the linen itself as soon as it enters into circulation with another commodity, the coat. Yet it reveals its thoughts only in the language familiar to it alone, the language of commodities. To say that labor in its abstract quality as human labor constitutes its own value, it states that the coat, insofar as it is equivalent to the linen and is thus value, consists of the same labor as the linen. To say that its sublime objectivity of value is distinct from its stiff linen body, it states that value looks like a coat, and that therefore the linen itself, as a value thing, resembles the coat as one egg resembles another, end quote. Wolff. In this way, a further autonomy of value is generated. The representation of the sociality of things within a designated commodity, which serves as the objective mode of existence for this sociality, such that one can carry this social connection around in one's pocket, yet just as easily lose it. Brentel now defines the contradiction inherent in the commodity as, on the one hand, a, quote, necessary connection, and on the other, quote, independence and a process of becoming independent vis-a-vis one another, end quote. Thereby precisely adopting Wolff's alignment with Marx's characterization in the Grundrisse. More explicitly than Wolff, and drawing upon Backhaus, Brentel emphasizes in this context that the commodity of the beginning thereby reveals itself as a, quote, commodity-money relation that must always already be presupposed, end quote. The, quote, formally grasped determinations, end quote, of the commodity, he argues, are realized only within the exchange relation between commodity and money, within the actual process of simple circulation. Consequently, the commodity exists solely as a commodity relation, and this relation in turn exists as a commodity-money relation. Brentel now identifies three stages in the development of the contradictory structure of the commodity on the path to money. 1. The contradictory structure of the commodity in itself, between use value and value, prior to the conceptual transition to the value form. Here the commodity cannot simultaneously and in the same respect be both use value and value. For if it were, it would not constitute a private product, but rather one a priori socially recognized, a status that would eliminate its character as a commodity. Its socially general form cannot therefore be expressed through its material natural form existing in and for itself. The provisional solution to this internal contradiction between use value and value, conceived as an unmediated unity within the commodity, in itself, or as an immediate contradiction, as Marx terms it, lies in its expression as an external polar opposition between commodity A, serving as the relative value form, and commodity B, serving as the equivalent form. Insofar as the use value of B counts as the value of commodity A, insofar as commodity A relates to itself as value, only through the mediation of its, quote, other, commodity B, the simple value form constitutes the, quote, first mediated unity of use value and value, and thereby realizes the, quote, autonomization of value vis-a-vis use value, end quote. A tendency already latent within the commodity itself, within the specific relation between two distinct commodities. 2. The contradictory structure, persisting throughout the analysis of the form of value, between the general character of value of commodity A and its particular mode of appearance within the use value of commodities B, C, D, etc. With this, however, value has not yet attained its adequate form of appearance. That is to say, the conceptual grasp of its real conditions of existence remains incomplete. The contradiction between use value and value now persists, moving from the simple through the expanded to the general form of value, in the guise of the contradiction between the, quote, in the guise of the contradiction between the generality of value and the particularity of its forms of appearance, quote, in specific use values, which therein prove incapable of adequately representing the generality of value, end quote. At this stage, many specific equivalent forms mutually exclude one another as the appropriate representation of value. That is, as a general valid form of value. Value still, quote, looks like a coat, like linen, tea, and so forth. Yet even at the level of the general form of value, this contradiction, which characterizes the expanded form of value, continues to exist, for at the level of abstraction inherent in the analysis of the form of value, any commodity may still assume the form of the general equivalent, the paradoxical Form 4 of the first edition. Thus the first chapter in the first edition of Capital, the version also favored by Brentel, concludes with a constellation of contradictions that remain unsolved and indeed unresolvable within the merely theoretical relation of commodities to one another. Three, the contradictory structure of a pre-monetary starting situation of the exchange process prior to the transition to the actual constitution of money. The constellation of Form 4 now recurs, incorporating the commodity owners as the starting situation of the exchange process. Quote, inasmuch as within such an exchange relation, every commodity must be simultaneously realized in both of its specifically social determinations. Yet in an objectively independent form, this is possible for the individual commodity only in opposition to its other determination. Quote. This contradictory structure is formulated by Marx from the perspective of actors within a pre-monetary exchange process, one that, taken in isolation, is merely fictitious. Each commodity owner desires that his own commodity be immediately exchangeable as a general equivalent, that all the commodity owners require as a general commodity, while insisting that all other commodities serve merely as particular use values for his own specific needs. Such a, quote, exchange process is necessarily doomed to failure, because all commodities mutually exclude one another from assuming the equivalent function. Consequently, there emerge as many, quote, general equivalents as there are particular commodities. Thus, along with the general equivalent, the commodities simultaneously lose their specific economic form determination and revert to the status of mere products. Alongside Backhaus and Brentel, Michael Heinrich may be regarded as the most resolute proponent of a monetary interpretation of Marx's value theory. According to Heinrich, within traditional Marxism, Marx is read merely as a socialist political economist who rejected specific political economic approaches. Marx's critique of political economy, by contrast, must be understood as a critique of categories directed at the entire theoretical field of political economy, as well as the attempts to resolve economic problems formulated on this basis, and thus simultaneously as a critique of theory and a positive analysis of forms. For Heinrich, the theoretical field of political economy constitutes a fundamental understanding of reality and science, shaped by forms of self-evidence that are specifically produced by social structures. The semantic and logico-syntactic core of its theories thus consists of four essential elements: anthropologism, the construction of economic facts based on a, quote, human essence, which, however, in reality represents nothing other than anthropologized, historically specific attributes of commodity owners. Individualism, the conception of individual subjects and their dispositions as the ultimate basis for the reduction or explanation of social phenomena. Ahistoricism, a consequence of the first two elements, leading to the conflation of historically specific social phenomena with social phenomena in general, or with the natural realm, and thus to the implicit or explicit presupposition of a, quote, natural economic order, end quote. Empiricism, the assumption that all economic phenomena are accessible to empirical observation and situated on an empirical level of theory. Moreover, Marx also noted the failure of political economy to resolve specific problems, of which the relationship between value and money is of primary significance here. In this context, however, and in contrast to interpreters such as Brentel and Wolff, Heinrich highlights that with absolute clarity, the ambivalence persisting even within the conceptual core of Marx's, quote, material analyses. In doing so, he articulates the theoretical conclusion of an engagement with Marx's work that still conceives of itself as an act of reconstruction. According to Heinrich, drawing upon Marx's own statements on the matter, even the argumentative strategy of inferring value as a tertium comparationis, referring to value as a tertium comparationis, I don't know, a third term of comparison, and abstract labor as the basis of its constitution and capital owes its existence to a process of popularization. This popularization in turn allows critics in the field of political economy to latch onto Marx's work in order to situate Marx, quote, within their own empiricist problematic, end quote, and subsequently to dismiss him. Heinrich argues that in A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, in the Notes on Wagner, and in A Letter to Kugelmann, it becomes clearer, more so than in Capital itself, that Marx's object of inquiry is not in the first instance the commodity in general, parenthesis, as Bumbawerk presumes, only to subsequently complain that Marx surreptitiously smuggles in the proof that value is constituted by labor, in parenthesis, but rather the commodity as the, quote, social form of the product of labor, end quote. Marx's objective, Heinrich contends, is to decipher the social form of labor, a form that finds expression in this specific type of product of labor, which exists solely within production relations characterized by a private division of labor. For this reason, in A Contribution to the Critique, Marx could even characterize the view of labor as the sole source of value, as a tautology. Furthermore, the commodity and exchange value discussed at the beginning of the critique of Contribution to the Critique. Let me repeat that. For this reason, in A Contribution to the Critique, Marx could even more characterize the view of labor as the sole source of value as a tautology. Furthermore, commodity and exchange value discussed at the beginning of the critique are not empirically encountered, simple objects or exchange relations determined strictly by quantities of labor time, entities for which Marx supposedly sought to provide direct empirical proof. According to Heinrich, the simple commodity-commodity relation is in reality always already the complex circulation relation of commodity sales and commodity purchases via money. Commodity, money, money, commodity. However, one must initially abstract from this complex relation in order to bring forth the empirically given relation between price-determined commodities and money as a theoretical, conceptually grasped object of inquiry. The beginning of the analysis is therefore, quote, a conceptual construction designed to investigate the most general determination of commodity production, the mediation of the social metabolism through exchange, unquote. Marx was well aware that, quote, average prices do not coincide directly with the value magnitudes of commodities, unquote. Yet Marx was convinced that the complex relationship of price-determined capitalist commodities, quote, can be adequately represented only on the basis of value theory, end quote. According to Heinrich, Marx's approach, conceived as a formal theory of labor, stands in clear opposition to the naturalist and individualist paradigm of political economy, whereas the latter views labor exclusively as an individual process between subject and object, introduces exchange as a direct consequence of the division of labor, ultimately conceives of it according to the model of immediate interaction between two commodity owners, accepts the commensurability of commodities as a simple given, and defines the measure of value anthropologically in terms of labor pain or utility. Marx does not merely regard commodity exchange as a form of mediation for social reproduction. Rather, Marx views commodity exchange as the expression of a specific form of social labor. He inquires into the historically specific conditions antecedent to the agents themselves, parenthesis, Brentel's Form 3, in parenthesis, that compel the socialization of labor into the economic form of commodity exchange. He inquires into the unconsciously produced form that renders the interconnection of isolated private labors possible as a systematic whole, Brentel's Forms 1 and 2. Consequently, Marx initially abstracts from the commodity owners and their motives, a move that constitutes a crucial argument against any recourse to utility as a potential base for the value equation. Utility, even that elusive concept of, quote, utility in general, unquote, invariably refers back to the motives of the commodity owners, or if understood as the urgency of a need, invariably presupposes unsystematic exchange relations determined by that very utility. The systematic social unity of concrete private labors is thus defined as abstract labor. In this way, labor assumes a, quote, dual social character, unquote. The division of labor yields social use values for others, and it is this aspect that constitutes the social character of concrete labors. However, insofar as labor is expended in a private and isolated manner, it does not a priori constitute an element of total social labor. Private and isolated labor must present itself as its opposite, abstract labor, in order to be subsequently recognized through exchange as a useful part of the total labor. To become socialized, concrete labors must, quote, count as equal to one another, which constitutes a further social character of labor, one specific to commodity production, end quote. According to Heinrich, the basis for this equivalence, or more precisely, one second. According to Heinrich, the basis for this equivalence, or more precisely the equality of labors, can be conceived in two ways, either as a property inherent in each individual private labor taken in isolation, or as a social relation obtaining among all individual private labors. Heinrich initially emphasizes the latter, the socio-theoretical determination, identifying it as Marx's revolutionary insight into the specifically social quality of commodity-producing labor, an insight he argues transcends the theoretical terrain of political economy. Abstract labor is characterized as a, quote, specifically social determination, end quote, of concrete labors, as their consolidation into a unit of social reproduction which, as Marx particularly highlights in his additions and changes, quote, constitutes itself only through exchange, end quote. Ultimately, it is said to represent, quote, not a natural but a specifically social equality, end quote. At the same time, it is emphasized that the abstraction from concrete labors and their reduction to abstract labor asserts itself as a real abstraction, operating independently of any cognitive acts on the part of commodity owners, and manifesting it instead through their actual deeds. Quote, in the case of abstract labor, as with value, etc., we are dealing precisely not with the merely nominalist-derived generic concepts. End quote. This point, Heinrich notes, must be maintained specifically in opposition to the thesis advanced by Backhaus and Reichelt, who attribute a, quote, constitutive function, end quote, to the, quote, acts of abstraction performed by subjects involved, end quote, in the formation of value. In several respects, Heinrich now identifies ambivalences in Marx's determination of the substance of value. 1. According to a contribution to the critique in the first edition of Capital, Marx still largely identifies, quote, abstract labor with simple, unskilled labor, end quote. A stance that should be regarded as a legacy of the Grundrisse, where abstract labor is still connoted as, quote, mechanical, contentless labor, end quote. Heinrich interprets this as a conflation of concrete and abstract labor. Disregarding skill reduces labor to an empirically observable, specific type of concrete labor, whereas abstract labor, as the substance of value, quote, exists nowhere as a specific mode of the expenditure of labor power, end quote. Heinrich. Moreover, Heinrich identifies naturalistic determinations of the substance of value in sentences such as the following, quote, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense. And in this capacity of equal human or abstract human labor, it forms the value of commodities, end quote. Here, abstract labor is said to be grounded in, quote, natural properties of labor, which, while always present, become relevant as, quote, value forming only within commodity production. Well, such interpretation does indeed supply a distinction that classical political economy failed to make, namely one analogous to its differentiation between use value and exchange value. It nevertheless fails to depart from the terrain of political economy with its conception of labor as a non-social process. This naturalistic tendency, evident in the first two subsections of the first chapter of Marx's Capital, is further reinforced by a popularizing passage inserted into the second edition, in which Marx employs a, quote, argumentation appealing to the rationality of the commodity owner, end quote, in order to lend plausibility to the concept of abstract labor as the substance of value. Many Marxists have subsequently followed these empiricist, individualist, and substantialist cues, effectively conceiving of abstract labor as merely concrete labor in general. Cited as an example is a statement by Wolfgang Fritz Haug to the effect that, quote, both, quote, concrete, useful, and, quote, abstract human labor remain ultimately reduced to natural processes, end quote. And I have a critique specifically of Wolfgang Fritz Haug on this channel by Werner Bonefeld. Regarding the fate of the passages interpreted by Heinrich as naturalistic, the following should be added. As early as the first edition, one finds the naturalizing statement that, disregarding the qualitative differences between the works, both are to be viewed as a, quote, productive expenditure of human brain, muscle, nerve, hand, etc., end quote, Marx, a formulation that was carried over into subsequent editions. Conversely, at several points in the first edition, the purely social character of abstract labor as the substance of value is clearly emphasized. In the second edition, the passage criticized by Heinrich is now inserted into a new, separate subsection concerning the dual character of labor. Here, as is well known, it states, quote, all labor is, on the one hand, an expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense, and in this capacity as equal human or abstract human labor, it constitutes the value of commodities. All labor is, on the other hand, an expenditure of human labor power in a specific purposive form, and in this capacity as concrete useful labor, it produces use values, end quote. Marx. In additions and alterations to Volume 1 of Capital, however, one finds three less problematic variants of this sentence, which dispense with the formulation regarding expenditure, quote, in the physiological sense, end quote. A phrasing that is misleading from the perspective of social theory, even though they too speak in concrete terms of a, quote, expenditure of abstract labor. These variants read as follows, quote, all labor is, on the one hand, an expenditure of human labor power, on the other, an expenditure of all power in a purposive form, end quote. Quote, all labor is, on the one hand, an expenditure of human labor power. The value of a product signifies that it represents nothing other than expended labor power, human labor simpliciter, end quote. Quote, bracket, all labor is, end bracket, on the one hand, the expenditure of human labor power in general, that is, quote, abstract human labor, end quote, and in this capacity as abstract human labor, it constitutes value, end quote. Marx. One second. Even the thesis advanced by Wolff and situated beyond such naturalism regarding the relevance of abstract labor for social integration into pre-capitalist communities, quote, insofar as total social labor must be distributed among individual spheres, and in the process, individual labors are equated with one another, end quote, is said to derive from such vestiges of classical theory. Wolff overlooks, so argues Heinrich, implicitly drawing on Brentel, quote, that the mere distribution of total social labor does not imply an equation of individual concrete labors. If a self-sufficient peasant family expends 1 hour of tailoring work daily alongside 2 hours of baking work, this constitutes no equation. In what quantitative proportion anyway? Or is it already presupposed that every labor counts as equally simple labor? But rather, the various concrete labors are distributed among different members of the family. The, quote, equation here is the act of the observing theorist, end quote. In this context, one can understand Heinrich's thesis that not only in pre-capitalist communities, but also within the capitalist mode of production, the character of concrete labors, that is, total labor understood as a material nexus of reproduction, is nothing, quote, homogeneous, quote, not a sum of like quantities, but a mere aggregate of comparable magnitudes, which are, quote, forcibly compared in exchange, end quote. This calls to mind Wolfgang Müller's concept of the, quote, totality of various individual labors. One might ask whether Heinrich is advocating a quasi-Aristotelian position, namely that equality is forcibly and artificially established, albeit not as in Aristotle's case because necessity demands it, but rather as a structural effect of a specific mode of social integration. Does Heinrich's position truly stand in opposition to Wolff's thesis, which holds that the equality of labors is not created in exchange, but rather becomes relevant in a different respect within production relations, characterized by a private division of labor, and is artificial only insofar as it serves as a social principle of unification? According to Heinrich, it is only as an analysis of the form of value, and in the chapter on fetishism in Marx's Capital, as well as in a contribution to the critique, that Marx explicitly formulates the view that abstract labor is a, quote, specifically social form of labor, end quote. That is a, quote, non-intentional, socially practiced relation of validity, end quote. This is corroborated as an effect of the actions of agents operating under conditions of a private division of labor. By the sole passage in Capital, where Marx addresses transhistorical aspects of the labor process in Chapter 5, in that passage there is no mention of abstract labor. Where am I? This issue now resurfaces with regard to objectivity and magnitude of value. For a social theoretical reading of abstract labor, value objectivity can therefore be nothing other than the, quote, objective reflection of a specifically social relation, end quote. Or alternatively, a, quote, socially practiced relation of validity, end quote. A naturalistic interpretation of abstract labor, conversely, inevitably leads to a substantialist conception of value objectivity as a substrate, quote, externalized into the individual commodity through an individual process of physical energy expenditure. According to this view, abstract labor enters into the commodity, quote, just as jam enters into a pancake, end quote. Thus, even, quote, prior to and independently of exchange, end quote, every commodity considered in itself is deemed to contain value. However, in contrast to the first two subsections of Marx's Capital, Marx clarified in the additions and alterations of 1871/72 that value is a social form of private products, that goods can possess their value character, and thus their commodity character, only in relation to one another, as a, quote, objectivity common to them, end quote. Only the material use value aspect of commodities constitutes a property existing independently of any specific social context, whereas goods qua commodities represent things placed into a social relation with one another by human beings under specific conditions, a relation in which alone they acquire a significance extending beyond the mere material particularity, their mere material particularity. Thus, from a scientific perspective, the property of, quote, value reveals itself as relational, a point Heinrich vividly illustrates. The property of, quote, redness may inhere in two distinct objects considered in isolation, whereas the properties of, quote, superior and, quote, subordinate exist only within a social hierarchy and do not attach to individuals as such when considered outside of that hierarchy. Value objectivity, as Marx, according to Heinrich, clearly establishes in the analysis of the form of value and in the section on fetishism, is thus a purely social object. Value consists in a social relation between objects and presents itself in the form of value and money as an objective property, yet one into which, in reality, not a single atom of natural matter enters. Drawing upon the work of Backhaus and Reichelt, Heinrich underscores the peculiar character of value objectivity, a character that he argues is systematically missed by both classical political economy and subjective value theory. While classical political economy reduces value to the physical, reduces value objectivity to the physical, viewing value objectivity as the, quote, expression of the expenditure of a quantity of physical labor, end quote. The subjective value theory conceives of value objectivity as the psychological, as, quote, utility estimates, end quote, or, quote, preferences. In contrast, however, following Marx, value objectivity reveals itself as, quote, objectively factual, yet without any physical magnitude entering into this objectivity, end quote. One second. I'm making sure this paragraph is right. In response to the critique of, quote, circulationism, specifically the identification of value with the form of value, as well as the, quote, two worlds doctrine positing a separation between material production and social circulation, advanced by Backhaus and Reichelt, among others, including those within the, quote, within the crisis milieu, which is like Robert Kurt's milieu, Heinrich nonetheless insists, much as Rubin did in his time, that even within the capitalist mode of production, products of labor cannot possess value prior to exchange. As he puts it, quote, viewed in isolation, outside the context of exchange, the commodity body is not a commodity but merely a product. Thus, within the exchange relation, it possesses an objective quality that it does not possess outside that relation, end quote. Elsewhere, Heinrich adds, quote, when Marx speaks of the value of a commodity, this is possible only if we presuppose an exchange relation between two commodities and single one of them out, end quote. According to Heinrich, the question of non-substantialist understanding of value ultimately boils down to grasping the, quote, character of capitalist socialization, end quote. Heinrich argues, quote, if one proceeds from the assumption that products of labor are already commodities and objects of value during the production process, that is, during the, quote, private expenditure of labor, then the distinction between the various forms of sociality is flattened out, or alternatively, the mediation of sociality through exchange, a mechanism specific to bourgeois society, is reduced to a subordinate subsequent act. Traditional Marxism, therefore, tends to effectively flatten out the distinction between Marx's critique of political economy and classical political economy, end quote. Heinrich. In doing so, Heinrich draws attention to the paradoxical consequences of a purely, quote, labor theory of value, such as the one championed by Robert Kurtz, crisis milieu, for instance. Such a theory of, quote, labor abstraction, end quote, asserts that value constitutes, quote, the social objectivity of the commodity, even of the individual commodity, prior to and independently of the secondary exchange relation, end quote. The exchange process is, however, one could argue along with Heinrich, the only truly social relationship that products qua commodities have with one another. Prior to this, no matter how strongly they may be oriented toward realization, they remain private products and the labor embodied in them remains private labor. The ultimately Proudhonian consequence of the labor abstraction approach would be to conceive of private labor and its products as already constituting abstract labor and value, whereby private labor would become immediately social labor and every commodity immediately exchangeable. Yet one must recall that, according to Marx, abstract labor is intended to be the specifically social form of concrete private labors. Substantialism thus defines labor as immediately social, thereby negating the very conditions under which it must first become abstract general in order to qualify as socialized. Heinrich thus clearly demonstrates that an alternative to the, quote, two worlds doctrine, end quote, which centers on the distinction between private and social labor, end quote, cannot be plausibly substantiated on the basis of Marxian theory. Quote, latent value, or the, quote, claim, parenthesis, the intention, in parenthesis, to produce value, do not, Marx argues, constitute grounds for value's existence. The concept of value, conversely, cannot be conceived within the specific nexus of production and circulation. Specifically, quote, private production and subsequent socialization through exchange. Let me repeat that sentence, I fucked it up. The concept of value, conversely, can only be conceived within the specific nexus of production and circulation, specifically, quote, private production and subsequent socialization through exchange, end quote. However, the question raised by Backhaus and Reichelt concerning the theoretical grounding of a, quote, intertemporal, end quote, concept of objective value, one that endures beyond the, quote, logical second, end quote, of the act of exchange, and thereby becomes self-reproducing, thus remains unresolved. If abstract labor is conceived as a social relation among private labors, then, according to Heinrich, the determinant of the magnitude of value cannot lie in the technological conditions of socially average labor time. For in his view, these conditions hold out the prospect of a determination of the quantum of value of, quote, each individual commodity independently of exchange, end quote, which would effectively render concrete labor time the measure of abstract labor. However, since abstract labor constitutes a social nexus, a relation between individual or privately isolated production units and total social labor, rather than between individual labor and the product, it, quote, cannot be expended at all, end quote. Consequently, neither is any individual labor value-forming, nor is any individual product of labor a commodity, a value thing, nor does it possess a magnitude of value. Here Heinrich appears to go even further than the, likewise cited by him, criticism leveled by Brentl against Engels. While Brentl relies heavily on the distinction between the formation of a societal average, in contrast to empirically measurable and surveyable private labor, as the basis and measure of value, Heinrich specifies the measure of value as, quote, abstract labor time, end quote. Furthermore, the technologically determined average labor time which is neither surveyable nor foreseeable by the individual commodity producer, does not appear here as a pre-circulatory determinant requiring supplementation by the determinant of aggregate societal effective demand. Rather, even in the case of average labor time, the principle applies that it cannot logically be determined independently of the market. According to Heinrich, abstract labor time as a measure of value is not concrete labor measured in time, but rather a socially constructed temporal magnitude characterized simultaneously by three reductions: to average labor time, to the labor necessary to satisfy aggregate societal effective demand, and to simple labor. The measure of labor thus characterizes that, quote, portion of the concrete labor time expended by the individual producer, which is recognized in exchange as a constituent part of aggregate social labor, end quote. This recognition, functioning as a, quote, quasi-measurement, takes place, quote, only by means of money, end quote. It is in this sense, too, that Marx's statement should be understood, that social labor time is, quote, not a ready-made presupposition, but a result in the making, end quote. Such an interpretation of the measure of value is already foreshadowed in references to the dual determination of socially necessary labor and capital, references advanced by Bloch, Pollock, Rosdolsky, and Reithout, and discussed within the otherwise rather traditional debates of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research as a, quote, circle in Marx's theory of value, unquote. Quote, value is held to be determined by socially necessary labor time. What constitutes socially necessary labor time is held to be revealed in exchange, and exchange itself is held to be regulated by socially necessary labor time. The concepts of exchange and labor time are thus mutually determined by one another, end quote. Horkheimer. Ulrich Steinfort goes so far as to deduce from this a consistently price-theoretical revision of the labor theory of value. He posits the incompatibility of the theory of value found in Volume 1, which contains a dual concept of socially necessary labor that presupposes average labor time and solvent needs, i.e. market conditions, as determinants of the magnitude of value, with that found in Volume 3, wherein a logical and historical prius of value over price is asserted. This thesis, in turn, is said to underpin Engels' theory of simple commodity production, a theory that functions as an empirical labor quantity theory applicable primarily to pre-capitalist exchange. However, following the first volume, it is now argued that, alongside the technologically determined average labor time within a given industry, effective demand also determines which portion of concrete private labor counts as abstract general labor and is recognized as socially necessary. This implies that, quote, the market alone, while not necessarily independent of whether the labor actually embodied in the commodity corresponds to average social conditions of production or not, yet possibly even without regard for this, end quote, emerges as the decisive instance for determining the magnitude of value. It is simply not sufficient for the constitution of value that expended concrete private labor merely corresponds to average social labor. Thus, the function of effective demand cannot be reduced to the role of use value as a mere prerequisite for, or vehicle for value. Consequently, quote, in the first volume, the law of value cannot serve the function of determining prices, end quote. Furthermore, based on these premises, values and prices, quote, cannot diverge from one another, end quote. Indeed, one must conclude that it is price that determines value, and not the other way around. Quote, it is no longer the quantity of social labor that determines the price or the exchange ratio, but rather the price or the exchange ratio that determines the quantity of social labor, end quote. The reduction of concrete labors to shares of total social labor, that is to abstract labor, effected through exchange and ultimately determined quantitatively by effective demand, in principle no longer permits, indeed renders logically impossible, the determination of precisely what quantum of social labor is, quote, objectified in a commodity or is represented by it, independent of the price realized in the course of exchange. Therefore, a fundamental distinction must be drawn between abstract labor and technically average labor, a distinction, however, that Marx himself fails to consistently uphold even in Volume 1 when he spoke of market prices fluctuating around value, rather than stating that the value of a commodity is, quote, any arbitrary quantity of abstract labor assigned to it in exchange, end quote. Consequently, the purpose of value theory cannot be to contribute to the determination of price magnitudes, but merely to effect a, quote, attribution of price magnitudes to the form of labor that alone counts under capitalism, end quote. Heinrich, however, refuses to draw the consequences of a price-theoretical reductionism, as well as the theory of money that is, as in the case of Steinfort, ultimately pragmatic in nature. Instead, Heinrich conceptualizes his critique of pre-monetary value theory in an anti-phenomenalist manner, insisting on the necessity of a conceptual distinction between value and price as categories situated on two distinct levels of abstraction. In an anti-pragmatist manner, conceiving the necessity of money not as a statistical regularity or a praxeological matter of convenience, but rather as a conceptual necessity for the representation of values. And in an anti-individualist manner, explaining the genesis of money not in terms of the utility considerations of individual actors, but rather in terms of their unconscious social actions, which are structured by the, quote, laws of the nature of commodities, end quote. In opposition to pure circulation theories of value, Heinrich regards Marx's notion of the realization rather than the, quote, let me repeat that sentence. In opposition to pure circulation theories of value, Heinrich regards Marx's notion of the realization rather than the creation of value in the act of exchange as entirely legitimate. This notion, he argues, points to the fact that, quote, that value is grounded in a specific relationship between individual private labor and total social labor, end quote. One must insist upon the, quote, logical difference between value and price, or respectively money, without which an explanation of price would no longer be possible. In contrast to classical approaches to price theory, which invariably treat the price form as an empirical given, many Marxist positions, according to Heinrich, conflate the logical priority of value with a temporal priority of value. In doing so, these Marxist positions reveal themselves to be empiricist readings of the initial analysis of the commodity, perceiving therein two measures of value, labor time and money, as existing on the very same ontological plane. On this view, the transition from the immanent to the external measure of value is regarded as a purely formal translation of a movement that has already, let me repeat that. On this view, the transition from the immanent to the external measure of value is regarded as a purely formal translation of a measurement that has already taken place, a view that presupposes a pre-monetary mode of existence and appearance for value, specifically concrete average labor time. Yet value objectivity, quote, exists only as shared value objectivity within exchange, and the universal exchange of commodities exists only as the relation of commodities to money, end quote. However, any theoretical construction that proceeds from the premise of money's neutrality, viewing money merely as a technical aid to exchange, must once again, quote, presuppose that the difference between privately expended and socially recognized labor has been abolished, end quote. In other words, it presupposes a direct socialization of labor that is not mediated through exchange. It is precisely in this third function of money, Heinrich argues, that the distinctiveness of monetary value theory, vis-a-vis both classical and neoclassical approaches, becomes apparent. Here money is conceived as a provisionally autonomous form of value, as the quote, material existence of abstract wealth, end quote, i.e. of value itself, as well as the quote, material representative of material wealth, end quote, i.e. of all use values. In contrast to its function as a medium of circulation, money here presents itself not merely as a store of value, a representative of value, quote, even and indeed especially outside the sphere of exchange, end quote, but as a potential end in itself, the beginning and end of the act of exchange. This aspect, Heinrich contends, transcends the paradigm of political economy, which is oriented toward use value, barter, and equilibrium, and for the first time opens up a perspective on an economic system whose immanent telos is the accumulation of abstract wealth, a reified representation of sociality devoid of specific content, rather than the maximization of, quote, utility. Furthermore, the cycles of reproduction within this system harbor an intrinsic potential for crisis, the bifurcation of the acts of purchase into distinct acts of buying and selling, a functional characteristic of money that renders a sale possible without a subsequent purchase, implies that the quote, reference to money, through which a coherent social nexus is established in the first place, simultaneously entails the risk of destroying that very coherence, end quote. Heinrich. In light of the diagnosis regarding the demonetization of gold, Heinrich now asks whether a commodity money must necessarily be presupposed within the framework of Marx's scientific grounding of forms of wealth. His thesis is as follows. While the analysis of the form of value indeed establishes the necessity of a general equivalent, a material expression of the value of all commodities in one and the same object, the necessity that this object must be a commodity is, according to Marx, presupposed without justification. Quote, just as it is impossible to logically deduce which specific commodity owners will single out as the equivalent commodity, it is equally impossible to deduce whether they will single out any commodity at all. End quote. The issue here, Heinrich argues, Let me repeat that last sentence. Heinrich's thesis is as follows. While the analysis of the form of value indeed establishes the necessity of a general equivalent, a material expression of the value of all commodities in one and the same object, the necessity that this object must be a commodity is, according to Marx, presupposed without justification. Quote, just as it is impossible to logically deduce which specific commodity owners will single out as the equivalent commodity, it is equally impossible to deduce whether they will single out any commodity at all. Quote. The issue here, he argues, is, quote, not whether the commodity money can be represented by mere signs, but rather whether there is any need at all for a commodity to begin with, one that would subsequently be represented by signs, end quote. is precisely this point that Heinrich calls into question. In contrast to the abstraction from the use value of two commodities, the representation of a commodity's value in a specific object constitutes, on this view, an abstraction of a fundamentally different nature. In this latter case, a concrete material entity serves to represent value. It, quote, functions as the materialization of that abstract generic attribute which stands on the same level as the individual commodities themselves, end quote. However, the individual representation of the genus, existing alongside the concrete individuals that collectively constitute that genus, need not, Heinrich contends, quote, necessarily be affected by one of its own constituent individuals, quote. This argument is substantiated in two steps. First is emphasized that the formulation regarding the, quote, material incarnation of value of money cannot be taken to imply that the use value serving as an equivalent is or becomes value directly. Rather, the supersensible general and social nature of value is merely represented or symbolized by the sensible particular and material nature of a use value within the framework of a specific relation. Thus, even gold as a commodity serving as money functions solely as a medium of immediate exchangeability, as value simpliciter. Value itself, it is argued, can never be grasped in a truly tangible form. Only its symbol or proxy is accessible. Consequently, quote, every form of money is a sign of value, even if it possesses a value of its own, unquote. However, and this constitutes Heinrich's second argument, a sign of value need no more possess value itself in order to signify it than, quote, the sign of, for quote, then, let me repeat that. However, and this constitutes Heinrich's second argument, a sign of value need no more possess value itself in order to signify value than, quote, the sign for, quote, animal must itself be a living, breathing animal, unquote. Marx, it is suggested, still possessed an inkling of this insight in the Grundrisse, but this understanding was subsequently lost in Capital. In the latter work, Marx employs the term, quote, sign of value solely in the sense of a proxy for the value of a monetary commodity, thereby projecting a specific historical configuration of monetary structure onto the theoretical derivation of the value form from the concept of value. The concept of money as a sign of value, it is argued, remains unaffected by Marx's critique of the conflation between the measure of value and the standard of prices. Furthermore, it posits his monetary theory as lying beyond the traditional dichotomy of monetary nominalism and metalism. Quote, both approaches inquire solely into what constitutes money, whether it is a social convention or the intrinsic value of the object itself. Yet the fundamental question of why money is necessary in the first place is never even raised, end quote. This applies to both interpretive approaches. Quote, they fail to grasp the mediating movement that transforms something into money. Instead, they offer a substitute explanation, end quote. Namely, conscious social interaction on the one hand and nature on the other. According to Heinrich, neither the positions of Levine or de Vrooy, which conceptually rule out the notion of money commodity, nor Gonzmann's model theoretic argument regarding the progression from a simple to a complex monetary theory, nor the account by Koch et al. Concerning the historical detachment of the monetary function from the money commodity succeed in plausibly refuting or substantiating a theory of money as a sign of value within the framework of the Marxian approach. Finally, Heinrich argues that the quantitative dimension of money's function as a measure of value cannot support a money commodity theory either. In this context, commodity exchange, conceived by Marx as a universal relation among commodities, is reduced to mere barter, and the analogy between the commodity-money relation and the measurement of weight on a beam balance is stretched beyond plausibility. For such an analogy, Heinrich contends, can claim validity only with respect to the value expression of an isolated individual commodity. Money, by contrast, relates all commodities to one another as values. We will engage primarily with the critique of Heinrich's rejection of the money commodity when we turn to consider the approach of Dieter Wolff. According to Heinrich, the rejection of a pre-monetary theory of value also necessitates the abandonment of the, quote, gravitation theory, in quote, of value, a perspective that views value as the gravitational or oscillation point around which fluctuating prices resolve. In this framework, value and price are conceptualized as empirically co-equal phenomena capable of quantitative comparison. However, according to Heinrich, the relationship between value and price is fundamentally a relationship of determination. Quote, value and price are, quote, congruent when the ratio of individually expended labor to total social labor alone determines the price, rather than, say, the contingent situation of the individual commodity owner, who may be compelled to sell cheaply, end quote. Moreover, as the exposition unfolds, this relationship is expanded to encompass the ratio of individual capital to total social capital, and move instead to cast an entirely new light on the so-called transformation problem. Consequently, this transition from values to prices of production emerges as a distinctly conceptual process, a further determination of the concept of value under conditions of competition among individual capitals, rather than as, quote, a change occurring in real time, end quote. Finally, Heinrich also inquires into whether and how the ambivalences inherent in Marx's theory of value impact his conception of socialism. In this context is primarily the pre-monetary presuppositions underlying Marx and Engels' model of the post-capitalist socialization of labor that he subjects to critique. Accordingly, both Engels and Marx draw parallels to the commodity structure in order to characterize a non-commodity-based social metabolism. In doing so, they implicitly posit a scenario of non-monetary commodity production in which concrete laborers already determine the magnitude of value of the products of labor. Engels suggests that what, under capitalism, still requires the, quote, makeshift expedient, end quote, of money, will under socialism be realized, quote, directly and absolutely, end quote, namely the measurement of quantities of labor time as the standard of exchange. For the first phase of communism, Marx advocates, quote, the very same principles that regulate the exchange of commodities, end quote, the exchange of concrete labor time for concrete labor time. And the concrete in that is like parentheses, so let me repeat that sentence. For the first phase of communism, Marx advocates, quote, the very same principle that regulates the exchange of commodities, end quote, the exchange of parentheses concrete and parentheses labor time for parentheses concrete and parentheses labor time. Moreover, according to Heinrich, provisions applicable solely to commodity-producing societies, specifically the reciprocity of actors mediated by labor products on the basis of a reduction to equal labor time, are projected onto socialism. Against this, it argues that within the framework of a monetary value theory, quote, individual concrete laborers are not directly comparable, end quote, because, quote, what is at issue is heterogeneous labor, end quote. And, quote, production and social need can only be compared on the market, end quote. Abstract labor, which according to Heinrich is concretistically truncated by Marx in his conception of socialism, and by Engels more generally, is by contrast a social attribute that is only, quote, constituted in the act of exchange and cannot be presupposed as a pre-social given. Significantly, Marx and Engels, quote, utter not a single word, unquote, regarding, quote, how this equality of individual labors is to be established within a mode of production not based on commodity production, end quote. Heinrich. Okay, so that is the end. I think this is a good place to wrap up the video. Yeah, that's the end of section 1 of section 1 of chapter 3 of part 1 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West. And again, part 1 is titled Motherfucker. Part 1 is titled Reflections on the Theoretical Foundations of Value. And chapter 3 is titled I had these all translated before, but I guess I did not. Object Theoretical Consequences. And the section of this, and the first section of that is titled Critique of Pre-Monetary Value Theory, Abstract Labor, Value, and Money. And this particular section that I just finished reading is titled Marx versus Engels and Marx versus Marx. Thank you so much for listening.